So, okay.
Aren't we missing a pictures?
She's always late. It's
okay.
a form of making an entrance.
Isn't that the Velvet Underground? She's always late.
That's beyond my scope.
It's fine. It's also not good small.
Okay, where are you circulated? Daniela, did you circulate the books?
No. They circulated themselves.
People stole them?
Yes. Which I
So
great.
at the end there will be a competition in which the people that ask the best questions that don't have a copy of the book will get a signed copy from Daniela. So she will determine which questions allow you.
It seems you have
that
a chance.
privilege.
You said the ones, it's plural. You know, so.
Absolutely. Eduardo, sit down. So, yeah. Daniela, just very quickly, something like 20 years ago, I left my office door open and she walked in. And I've known her since then. But I mention that because Daniela could be anywhere. She could be in outer space, in hyperspace, in digital space, in autonomous zones. She could be anywhere, but she's here. So we are incredibly unfortunate. We're incredibly lucky. Her physical presence, along with Patricia, who's not paying attention, and Elizabeth is not. Okay, so we'll start with Daniela in her hyper-vigilant form of presence, introducing metaphor and why it matters to her in a concise, brief, and intelligible way. Metaphor has two lines that I love. One is that hesitation that becomes an academic life. Brilliant and busted, Velasco. Then secondly, that unbearable rambling that is scholarly discourse. So she's obviously hostile, antagonistic, critical, and anxious, and we should calm her so far as we can with questions that elicit that metaphorization, which is her neologism. I have an incredibly intelligent friend at University of London, hair down to his waist, deeply unhappy like all brilliant people. And the one conversation that I've had with him in the last decade was he said, I'm really pissed in the American sense of upset as opposed to drunk. I'm really pissed that I didn't make up the word metaphor myself. So with that, we will start with Daniela. Jesús Velasco runs long distance every day around the tympana of text. He's always in the margins and elaborating the margins, frequently with very few clothes on, but I won't go into that. He's a fitness fanatic, but the fitness is intellectual fitness, and you can see him there, lovely shape. Doctors have repaired him, and hi. Okay, then Eduardo is world famous, no need to mention, but comp lit at Princeton. I imagine lives in New York, because if you're consigned to New Jersey, you end up in New York. And actually the most kind of esoteric thing that Eduardo told me, which I didn't know before, although I should have, and relates to post-structuralism. Hi. Professor Peters is here finally, so just mark the entrance. Yeah, she's late, we were waiting, and in consequence, the embrace should be there. That he, Drusilla Cornell, who was one of the founders of this law school, Stanley Fish, who was a professor here for many years, and Pat Williams, I think, although she can contradict me, were all part of a reading group with Jacques Derrida, who also came to this law school in the late 90s, early 2000s, at UC Irvine in California. Never knew that, and like so many other things, Eduardo knows far more than I. Okay, then Patricia, Eduardo's up there, and Elizabeth Povinelli, a geontologist who is geolocated somewhere other than here, but she may manifest at any time, it's hard to tell. Okay, with that, and bearing in mind that there are prizes in the form of signed copies of the book, there are also the most exquisite cardamom buns that are there for those who take them first.
There are 3.
Yeah, the Trinity. Pater, Filius, Spiritus Sancti. Okay, so Daniela, take the floor. Stand on a chair so people can see you. And introduce.
I cannot do the same performance, so I don't. Okay. Yeah, wow. Hi everyone, this is my first book, maybe the last, I don't know, but for sure it's the first, and it's the first book presentation, and therefore I am extremely overwhelmed, and I didn't think I would be, and it means a lot to me, like really, that you are all here. I just want to say that I don't want to pretend this is normal for me, it's not, so thank you very much. I also want to thank, of course, Peter and TNA for organizing this and for making this possible. And Peter asked me to give a short overview of the context of the book and I will try to, but just stop me when it's too much. I know. And because he said that he's anxious, I cannot confess now that actually I am the first time in my life, I think, a little shy, but okay. So I want to start with the book. I want to start with the acknowledgements, and the reason I want to start there, although it doesn't even have page numbers, so as though it does not quite pertain to the content of the paper, I want to begin with it not only as a gesture of gratitude to the people who devoted their time and thoughts to thinking with that book and with us here today, but also because it is very much part of the argument of the book that thinking is always a thinking with thoughts, with ideas, spaces, places, matters, institutions, even markets. So the speakers here today have not only taught me how to think, so they are to blame if you didn't like it, through their scholarship, but also they have shaped the very possibility of my thinking through how they navigate institutions and different ones, position themselves within and against forms of power, and encounter the margins, Jesús, peculiarities, images, and dynamisms of knowledge productions, both inside and outside of academia. So in other words, I think they have, to a large part, created the very conditions that made the book possible and made the thinking about thinking possible. For example, because we are a little bit anecdotal, Peter introduced me early on, I guess 20 years ago, to the honorable circus of academic institutions, really from publishing to my first conference, to appearing, becoming known, and very importantly, insisted constantly that I finally sent off this manuscript. And that was really, that's why it exists now. Patricia Williams taught me that thinking begins in moments of incommensurability and indeterminacy, where any retreat to reason, morality, or judgment necessarily fails. Eduardo Cadava taught me how to inhabit and at the same time dismantle institutions of power, as well as powerful institutions. If that always worked, I'm not sure, but I'm very grateful for the support. Jesús, I met at my very, very first conference, 2016 at Yale University, where he undoubtedly aware that I was pretty nervous, and not least because of the discouragement I had received from a Princeton professor the night before, created a very kind and safe space for me to step kind of confidently into a world that felt very intimidating to me at that time, and something has continued throughout the friendship. Elizabeth Bobinelli's generosity in thinking with me, in co-authoring an essay with me and Zulaikha on concept creation and in supporting efforts to push the boundaries of academic thought has shaped not only this book, but also created a form of belonging to a way of thinking that is not simply academic, and finally, Zulaikha Ayub basically has co-written this book with me from the very first sentence and first day to editing it 10 times to, yeah. So from the bottom of my heart, it's a little sentimental, but this book would not exist without you all, and I'm very honored that you are here. This leaves me only for a few minutes to discuss the book. So I want to say, partly it emerged from two pressure points. The first was the university itself, so as traditional institutions of thinking and knowledge production, and dominant modes of thought, representational modes of thought, with the potential violence it carries. So it was a critique from within, but at the same time, it was also a time where the institutions, the universities, were already attacked pretty much. Politically, through neoliberalism, so we're under a lot of pressure, and even more so today. So there's also an argument for thinking and finding ways to think with this double-edged sword. The other point comes from the research into technology and governance, and that's what I mainly do now. When I began writing the book, I became interested in anarcho-capitalist legal thought. That's basically thinkers that argue that law and governance, that we don't need a state and the government, and everything, including law and legal institutions, should be governed by markets, so supply and demand. And that's also pretty much what we see now. So from the beginning of the writing to now, with AI and blockchain and the demise of international law for various reasons, this has become more and more prominent with private cities, startup cities, with Peter Thiel's praxis wanting to take over Greenland, the real estate development in Gaza, and Trump's freedom cities. So these two things came together, and the question was, can we rethink thinking and legal concept creation in a manner that does not reiterate the traditional modes of thought, and also thinks with but beyond the university to think about the future of law in a technology-mediated world. Might not only be clear, it might be only clear at the very last, at the epilogue, but this was what was behind it. So to summarize very quickly the chapters, the first chapter, Synesthetics of Thought, asks the reader to reconsider what it means to think. And that's, of course, not a new question. It challenges representational modes of thought, so modes that rely on metaphor, recognition, comparison, analogy, and the assumption of the separability of mind and matter. I trace how such habits have long been tied to power, colonial orders of knowledge, hierarchies of reason, and institutional claims over who gets to name, classify, and determine the reality. I contrast this with Matterphorics, which apparently I always have an issue pronouncing, a mode of thinking with that begins from the inseparability of meaning and matter. So thinking emerges relationally across bodies, forces, environments, and encounters. Thoughts, words, and concepts themselves are metaphorical configurations that operate in the world. And to engage with these concepts ethically requires what I call ethics, so synesthesia and ethics of collaborative sensing and sense-making, pushing thought to the point at which the separation between mind and matter dissolves, and from which point, the point of indeterminacy, we can create new legal concepts. The second chapter then shows how the ethics as a method can be brought to bear on governance and legal systems through metaphorical case studies. For example, on Felix Baumgartner's supersonic free fall from the stratosphere, which exposes the indeterminacy of concepts such as border, sovereignty, legal subjectivity, property. And it also serves as a segue into broader questions of sense-making within frontier spaces, and I think that's really important right now too. So back then it was outer space, the deep sea, crypto space, but now in general, blockchain, AI, where legal orders are dissolving or being made redundant, new ones are evolving without us seeing or being aware of what is happening, and often forcefully and violently. So the modes of thinking that we don't want to reiterate. In the last chapter, Autobiography of Man and the Cuts of Law, to cut it really short, it argues that there's an anthropocentric narrative that places, we know, the abstract, marginalized version of man and humanity into the middle, into the center of the world. And so it performs a cut between life and non-life. And that chapter is about trying to decentralize that subject and trying to think about how law is narrating right to intellectual property rights, legal personhood, patenting of genetic material. So that deals with the definition of life and how law and the narrative of the conscious man excludes many forms of life and living. And then at the very end is just an epilogue, but that's basically where all of this had led to my work in law and tech, and in an attempt to build legal concepts within academia, but also outside, in nonprofit as well as in a startup, trying to build decentralized material legal concepts that materialize collectively and that could counter the ideas that the tech bros have. I think that's about it.
Terrific. Yeah, bubbles must be burst.
Yes.
Okay, Eduardo's leaving, so we'll ask Patricia, who has the furthest to travel, if that's okay, to kick us off, because we need a Parisian point of view. If you want to talk in French, don't. Go with English. And Patricia is world famous and for alchemy as much as anything else. So alchemical views of the Matterphoric are perhaps one of the most surprising and paradoxical of the possible theoretical inventions that she, with her 2 pairs of spectacles, will alternate between.
Oh, muted.
Unmute
You're
yourself.
muted, yeah. Oh, you're going to use sign language?
Hopefully I'm unmuted now, is that right?
Great, yeah.
And these 2 pairs of spectacles are actually quite necessary. One of the things that I'll come to in just a moment is the degree to which I bonded with Daniela shortly after I met her, because we both have a form of synesthesia. And my expression of synesthesia is apparently with a physical defect in my eye. So I have 2 different eyes that work at 2 different levels. So I literally have 2 sets of glasses. So forgive me. There is a rationale. It's not just this old lady looking crazy. I don't know if Tiania is there, but
I can share the image.
Pardon me?
I can share the image if you want.
Would you, I mean, Peter had mentioned an image, and I actually had on my website an image that Eduardo sent me, which is, and believe it or not, that's me in another body. Let's just put it that way. That is me. There's Eduardo, there's Derrida, there's Stanley Fish. That is, anyway, I just happened to have that, so I just wanted to illustrate what Peter had talked about. It was an interesting period of fellowship in which I guess, well, there's much to be said, but I will skip over that right now. I mean, I think the picture sort of speaks for itself, so I will shut up about that now. In any event, I really am really delighted to be here, and I wish I could be there, but I'm so happy to participate in this celebration of amazing Daniela's amazing, truly and uniquely wonderful book. And I have a long string of superlatives, but I really do think that Daniela's book merits every encomium that any of us can muster. And I have followed Daniela's career with awe and delight. It's been at least a decade. I was figuring it out that I first met her. She sat in on one of my classes. She came to Columbia, and she just blew me away. And this was in 2016. I had to look it up. And I don't wish to speak ill of all my other lovely lawyer hatchling students in that class, but there was no comparison because she was and is such an extraordinary thinker. And my class focused on jurisprudential questions of contracting, mutual regard, discourses of exchange. The title was The Anatomy of Autonomy. And like the title, it was pretty staid. It was basically about conceptual limits of contract law and what happens when the balanced collective governance we think of as constitutional law or contract or human rights law is displaced entirely by the narrow rules of private exchange. Daniela, however, was and is a whirlwind of a thinker who theorized well beyond that concern to ponder the rapidly evolving realm of tech governance. And again, this was back in 2016. And when a certain still present with us tech titan, for example, proclaimed that there shall be no law on Mars all the way back then, Daniela took such statements seriously, while the rest of us were sort of saying, ha ha. She took it not as mere hyperbole, but as reflecting many technology companies' evasion of publicly accountable law enforcement right here on Earth. And so you see it in this book. She has tracked the transhumanist movements, hyper-libertarian effusions. She has brought a critical lens to new technology's ability to create anarchic evacuations of human sensibility through monopolistic reorganization of society and its institutions. She tracked the mapping of new cartographies, like those charter cities to which she alluded, owned by tech companies. She saw and tracked, mapped the homesteading movement, the homesteading on the moon, or the displacement of globally transparent state-backed monetary systems with cybercurrency, or the creative economies of non-fungible tokens. She studied spaces some transhumanists have mistakenly declared as beyond law or beyond the reach of the state, like, again, high seas or outer space. And as she has been theorizing, such lawless spaces are not just imaginary, as has become increasingly evident in the 10 years since I first heard her present her thoughts about this. But of course, they're rapidly crystallizing into new economies, new properties, new striations of belonging and exclusion. Furthermore, Daniela writes so eloquently about the affective or synesthetic dimensions of new dynamic arrangements that both undergird and exceed traditional notions of jurisprudence, that entangle science, pseudoscience, and technological design, and that engage materially with world-building outcomes that we feel as justice or injustice. And watching her remarkable dissertation unfold into this book has been one of the great satisfactions of my academic career. This book dissected everything from global migration, Kafka, markets for palm oil, emerging technology markets, algorithmic fairness, metaphors of contagion, environmental justice. And in each thread of her thought, there is a grounding concern about what lives, what is erased, what exercised, what memorialized, what consigned to the realm of invisibility or oblivion. She meticulously traces the subtlest maneuvers, disguises, discoveries and rediscoveries of agency and subjectivity. And she certainly inspired my own thought, and certainly my recent writing. I find myself asking over and over again, where is it that a single body ends and the complex social webbing of prosthesis begins? So she certainly brought to that class, the class where I first met her, a focused mastery of law, philosophy, and finance. She enlarged the discussion to study of fiduciary responsibility in the context of Web3 architecture and software design and governance of new technologies. She is one of the most comprehensive thinkers I know, and her interest in the economies of digital assets, Bitcoin protocols, and other cryptocurrency projects certainly positions her on the front lines of seismically transforming legal and banking regulatory schema. And the conversation with her that has unwound since over those 10 years, for me, has been so rich, so enlightening, so fascinating, such a gift, and such a gift of friendship. Thank you, Daniela. As the philosopher Christian Soros has said, the future of the political body depends on its ability to receive the human heart. And I just want to say a little bit about that, because the start of this friendship with Daniela, again, for me is marked most profoundly by that realization, as I alluded to in the beginning, that we both have forms of synesthesia. And I used to say that I suffered from synesthesia. And Daniela hastened to revise, redirect, and correct that description. And again, it's because my synesthesia was actually a physical thing. You can look in my eye and you can see that the optic nerve actually never closed. So literally the interior of my optic nerve is like floating around and does crazy things with my brain. And so I used to think of it literally as, you know, the doctors from the time I was born sort of always, they would send medical students to look at this because it's so rare. And I used to think that, again, that it was a neurological condition. And now, thanks to Daniel, I've come to regard it as a gift of vision, of sight and sound, of multiple sensations, playing philosophical leapfrog in my brain and in the circuitry of my body as it interacts with the world. So let me sort of build on that personal note, a revisiting of what I said some years ago when Daniela organized that first conference in Princeton entitled Synesthesia, in which he asked me to speak at it. I heard it, again, too literally. I was actually confused because I understood synesthesia as a neurological disorder, for me as an atypical or non-normative confusion or a porousness of vision, sound, and smell. Because for me, I experienced synesthesia as a riot of color and confusion in my brain sometimes. Did you see that, I say, when I meant, did you hear that? Did you hear that when it's dominantly, for others, a visual experience? And smell is sometimes a near hallucinatory intrusion, and there isn't really anything of olfactory note that others might detect, but rather it turns out to be a musical note. And so it's messy, really, really messy in here, which translates to out there. It's like a big open pit of a nervous system, as though navigatory neural paths weren't laid down through the forest early enough, in utero or something. And now the brain and the body and me and the world and all around is one perpetually leaky, simultaneously overflowing, jungled continent of confusion. Initially, in other words, I thought of this as a kind of experience, again, not just as neuroscience, but it took me a minute to realize that Daniela was instead crafting a theory of precisely what makes life messy. That this conference of hers was to be about the synesthesia of law's body, as well as the bodies of lawyers, and lawyers as mouthpieces, and judges as multifactorial transmission stations of affect and aesthetics and art making, and citizens as corporate, and corporations as sensoriums. That this was a body of thought about theaters of justice and lyric and law, as the great late Barbara Johnson once put it. It was about anthropomorphism and ghostly subjects, objects that speak, silence that writes volumes, and the life of witness without words. And I love that it is a book about the scrambling of the sensible and the sensed, about narrative dust as much as the large stones of footstubbing refutation, that it is about the overlap of the vivid and the viscous and the dangerous and the dry, the aerial and the interior, the mimetic and the multiple, the green grass of reconciliation and plain old death. It is about the infernal sound of that droning drone and the cool, filigreed prettiness of the algorithmic slots into which our pounded existence is deposited. We wait for water, mix with concentrate. Law's project of reconstituted lives. And if it's not too much trouble, Janya, I wonder if I could have those two images now.
Sure.
Is it possible to do that? And I just wanted to share the sort of work that I don't think I would have read the same way without Daniela's 10 years of instruction, tutelage, and vision. But this is, I just wanted to share this because it so reminded me it's of the kind of work that Daniela is doing in the theoretical world. It just seemed like a lovely illustration. This is the Iranian-Australian artist, Nassim Nasser. And this first image is of her piece, 40 pages. And this is literally, she took the images from 40 pages of her passport of what it took to travel through all the worlds that ended her up in Australia. And then she put them on her body. And wears it as a sort of visible, that the matter of passports becomes, in this image, I finally had a label, this is a metaphorical image of what the laws of passports and borders do to the human body. And the next image, please. And this is the one that moved me most. This is her image. And apparently, and I can't actually find, some of you may know this artist better than I tried to find the image, the explanation of the image. It's called Unspoken Words, but apparently what she did with it was she literally chewed the texts of some of the Iranian orders about the hiding of women's bodies. And she chewed it until it spewed out of her mouth. And it became a sort of liquid that poured over her body. And the blue ink was masticated to the point of the enveloping liquid and obscuring curtain for her body. And for me, that felt so much a summary of my relationship to the United States Constitution right now. I wanted to pick up the Constitution and masticate it until it became something I could extrude and pour out of my body in another form that spoke as vividly and eloquently and as visually and as multisensorily as these particular images. But thank you, Daniela, for allowing me to see and to see differently and to think through with you over these years.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. And I think, Elizabeth, you have the second furthest distance to traverse. And so if you would like to enlighten us with your perception of Daniela's scribblings, we would be excited.
Well, first of all, it's always such a pleasure listening to you, Pat, and your mind, but also you have the most beautiful speaking voice. I just want to say, it's like when I was looking, I was looking at that image, I was thinking the voice as liquid and your voice as liquid. So thank you. I have never had such a beautiful voice. Mine is crackly and unhinged. So anyways, first of all, when my doctor said to me yesterday in her inimitable bedside manner, "What's wrong with you? Either rest and get over this virus or die." I thought, okay. But I was so looking forward to celebrating this singular achievement of Daniela's that I couldn't simply obey or disobey her. So first of all, and again, thank you for allowing me to zoom in, although I'm really only up on 27th Street. I'm not in Paris. And I'm here hovering beside you in space in a screen projection. And anyone who reads the beginning of Daniela's masterpiece will know that I'm quoting her introduction when I say that I'm excommunicated from the gathering, as a virus could be said to be exerting its right to assassinate me. And it can assassinate me, but I don't think, and especially in light of this incredible book, of course, the virus does or doesn't have the right to do so. It needs no right to do what it's doing. Nor do I need to assert that it intends to assassinate me or not, though I could lend it a metaphorical hand and say it does, and it could lend me back a spike protein. And hand and spike protein grasp each other in strange and differentially materializing ways. In this way, the virus and I, we sense each other, we create thoughts about each other, but we really have no need to represent each other's desires or intentions in order for us to have a co-materializing relation. The way I might represent the virus certainly could impact its ability to spike me or not. But the relation we have, the metaphoring relation we have, has a way of producing thought that's separable from the production of ideas or representations about each other. We matter each other forth separately than we or I represent each other. We are, in other words, what Daniela presents so powerfully, interprets so powerfully, in a moment of where Deleuze reads Spinoza, and from his reading of Spinoza, argues that there are two ways of producing thought, or perhaps two kinds of thought making, thinking about thought. On the one hand, thoughts that work through ideas, which we usually think in terms of representation, and thought that doesn't work through ideas, which Deleuze, building on Spinoza, associates with affect and affectus. That is, we think each other affectively or synesthetically without thinking each other representationally. And this is at the heart of this really amazing book. What's at stake if we foreground, we try and matter forth a mode of thought that is not based on idea production or representation inside the law and inside the academy in which the law is taught and then extruded into practice. I guess I met Daniela later than Pat did, so I looked it up too, and it was 2020 when she and Zulaikha were editing a special issue of Theory and Event, which went under the same name as this masterful book. And if I remember correctly, I created total chaos of what it should have been a very straightforward interview. So they said, we think what you're doing is part of what we're calling Matterphorics. But I can't remember, so I'm very curious. I hope someone reminds me. I also think that perhaps once in my life, I tried to not create chaos, to keep steering us back toward a more normative interview when Zulaikha and Daniela kept going, no, let's experiment with form. And they had diagrams. And I remember endless index cards being stacked and restacked and diagrammed and rediagrammed. And I think the profundity of both of their minds swamped even mine. I was like, okay, I can't do it anymore. Let's just have an interview. But it really moved me, the desire to think an interview not as a conveying, again, of thoughts about ideas, but rather an interview whose form would produce in a synesthetic relation. So I first of all, I've always wanted to apologize for failing y'all in your mission. In any case, I was less intrigued at the time, and still am less intrigued by what I thought, and more by the concept that they were developing and now is so fully and robustly and overflowingly developed in the book. That is, and I also thought the term Matterphorics really captured provocatively, while it focalized the conversation that was occurring, both in my own work, but among many people, a network of people I was thinking with, about the limits of representation when it came to our understanding of the differential materializations of power in late liberalism. So, and a concept, the Matterphorics as a concept that didn't seek to be a metaphor, right? So it itself, by contrasting the concept Matterphorics to metaphor as a concept, but with the content of metaphor as metaphorical, really trying to produce an intervention in the production of academic and legal thought. And for me, at the heart of it, and hopefully I'll suggest why, at the heart of this concept was an insistence not simply on materialization, but differential materialization in the ongoing wake of colonialism and its technologies. So there are so many aspects of this book to praise. Really, there's just too much and too much and too much to praise. Including its powerful grasp of the big guns in critical theory, like, and Daniela takes all the monsters and kind of juggles them as if, look, they're not so hard. You just juggle them around, right? But not in a flippant way, in a way that as she moves them and puts them in motion, you can begin to sense a different way of producing thought than you would if you were just reading them for the ideas in their book. And at the heart of her, like, I'm going to keep on moving these around until we can see something, like, when you take a stick and you can actually begin to see the image, just become the after effect of the movement. Daniela says, what's at stake in all of these is how do we give in to immanence rather than trying to represent it. And thus she riffs on Haraway, staying with the trouble, but here it's staying with the immanence rather than jumping to some level in which we can capture the shape of things, whether we jump into an ontological claim, or we jump into a planetary commons, or wherever we jump into a scientific theory that then we metaphorically extend to the everything and everywhere. What happens to the practice of law, the study of law, the understanding of law, and its academic grounds if we give into, and this is her phrase, give into immanence, rather than falling back lazily onto representation? That is, Matterphorics, I think, is a poetical reflection on a form of critical engagement that focuses on how text laws make, do, energetically distribute matter as they create different bodies in their forces. There's not a universal law that is then being operated. There is the making of laws, and here we mean physical laws as much as discursive laws. There's a making of the laws so that some bodies can leap off the edge of space, and other bodies will continue to sink in the toxic miasma of the mining fields that produce the ships, the technologies, the digital arrays that allow such leaps to occur. I haven't read any book that goes so far in pushing beyond what, again, just to pull in some old or even older theoretical titans, something that Gayatri called the double session of representation. So fundamental to the way in which our political and legal engagements of colonialism have operated, namely on the double session of political representation, right, which, begins with the question of the reasonable enough man, woman, person in their hut, and has extended into the more than human nature, right? And the question of who speaks on behalf of political representation, but also, on the other hand, the aesthetic, if you will, representations of Darstella, right? So you have political and aesthetic representation, and these two forms have completely captured not only the practice of the academy and legal thinking, I think, but also have captured what we think thought itself is. Thought is its representational force, both aesthetically representing, speaking on behalf, or politically. And thus, Daniela asked, what gets unhinged in law, in the academy, and in theory, when both of these representational demands and comfort zones are no longer the focus, and more what keeps us from sensing what's truly at stake in thought's metaphorical power that is thought as energetically composing and decomposing worlds at the same time under certain conditions of power. So Daniela anchors the unhinged nature of the anchors her unhinging of theory and politics on an understanding of thought grounded in representation through this concept of synesthetics. I myself first really began thinking about the synesthetic through Susan Buck-Morss's wonderful and definitely unhinged exploration of the concept in the history of the Frankfurt School, and more specifically Benjamin's work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, where he uses this understanding of the synesthetic and how it might be remobilized for a new way of thinking about the politics of art, or art as a political practice. And in Buck-Morss's approach to the synesthetic, she begins with the way in which the uncanny breaking of aesthetics into a philosophical field. So the aesthetic as something that was excluded from philosophical reflection really until the 18th and 19th century. And more importantly, Buck-Morss, is interested in the way that when philosophy takes the aesthetic and shapes it into a philosophical problem, they anesthetize the unruly nature of the synesthetic that animates all aesthetic experience. So
Elizabeth, a brilliant point, but we should move on soon if we can.
Yes, I'm done now. There you go.
Wow, look at that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And wonderful of you to turn up in the company of your virus with only one pair of spectacles. So let us move on to Jesús. Velasco moves between texts on a Ducati motorcycle, and so we'll talk quite quickly.
I will talk
But
quite
so
quickly.
long as you pay attention and he stays on two wheels, we're in good shape.
Yeah, I am going to be very brief. Actually, I could say just thank you and move on.
Very good talk.
Yeah, excellent. See you tomorrow. But I'm not going to do that. Instead of
No, come to the front so people can see you.
Is that right?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah. That face has to be visible.
All right. You don't know this, but you know this is the inaugural Matterphor is Daniela offering my oldest child a box of socks that is so entangled with our life that my little one inherited them, and they're still alive. But talk about entanglements. This book. Can I have my book? Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, thank you very much. This book has accompanied me to 3 countries, flying back and forth at over 38,000 feet of altitude, crossing many jurisdictions and looking from afar but with desire. The points where orbital dynamics kick in and law itself gets to be redefined. At one point, while I was reading about the transformations bodily fluids experience during a free fall from that indeterminate line where there is and there is not outer space, where one is neither a satellite nor an astronaut, not even an astronaut, I started bleeding and leaving traces of that blood on page 140. Yeah.
The one I gave you.
Yes. I had to stop the bleeding, which was hard because I was on a plane, and at the same time I could not stop reading. Here comes to mind Problemata 18 of Pseudo-Aristotle. Because why not? On another occasion, already well-grounded, albeit not kneeling on earth, a piece of brioche covered with peanut butter accidentally took off, and after non-pressurized flight, ended up landing on page 186. In the rush to avoid the tragedy, crisscrossing of hands of different ages and sizes, a coffee mug also expressed its opinion. Traces of the sacred drink impregnating the page and becoming one. Coffee page, page coffee à la brioche. This book is mine. All my genetic information is in it. Forever entangled with my reading, my mattering, the book that was, at its turn, the entanglement of capitalistic processes, educational endeavors, revolutionary thinking widths, breathing, sleeping, loving, perhaps also crying. How many other possible, non-comparable, unprecedented, non-representational entanglements can be thought with in regards to the relationships one could establish with this book. In electronic form, when language and electrons crash into each other all together, in the form of a paperback like the one I was sent, where the exchange of genetic and material elements becomes unavoidable, in the form of capitalistic exchange through the acquisition of the book, or the lending, in which many possible readers collaborate in the process to think differently, perhaps leaving hosts of traces that become transgenerational thinking, glosses or reading marks that are then followed or ignored by somebody else who will also leave these marks. What about the chemical processes that change the object in time? Pages in and pages out have been pursuing the question of metaphorical thought. I don't think I have arrived to a perfect understanding of the matter, because my brains are sometimes like feta cheese. But I think I have understood one thing. Matterphorics is not a thing. It is indeed a complex interaction of different processes that beyond, outside of representation, explore the ways to think with even those things, those experiences, those beings, alive or not, or like viruses, Elizabeth's ones, that are neither alive or dead, but they still do their thing. Those things that think, even if that thinking is unbeknownst to us or to me. In that sense, Matterphorics also challenge the idea that philosophical responses to philosophical questions encompass a concept. Maybe Matterphorics is something different than a concept. What I think I have understood is the importance of responsibility, not responsibility, which seems to be a unidirectional recognition of modes of representation. Responsibility seems to be the ability to engage, to entangle, to respond in a sense that does not intend to make sense, but to sense, to exist in a sensorium that is in constant flux of interactions, or, to use Daniela's favorite word, entanglements. Matterphorics, hence, does not seem to offer responses, but the continuous, labyrinthine need to continue studying, to question the comfort of things that are, and things that represent things that are. When this book was already in press, proofs probably revised a couple of times, Felix Baumgartner kept free-falling and getting entangled. I have a friend who is so keen on nominal determinism that I have ended falling for it altogether. Felix means happy in Latin. And I don't have to tell you what a Baumgartner is. Mr. Baumgartner is now diving somewhere in earth, metamorphosing in other forms of life that know no frontiers, for whom the laws of possession do not apply, whose thought is non-institutional. He cannot recover any golden chalice, can't return to fly or to pronounce his opposition to immigration, his defense of authoritarian frontiers, while being so free as to figure out other frontiers not to be crossed, other laws not to be broken, other privileges to be protected, other forms of representation to be postulated. But his words still resonate in a wide sensorium, where laws can be produced, and where these laws intend in particular to extend the definition of criminality and the definition of those subjects who, being considered a surge, a wave, a caravan, become criminals themselves by dint of that. Death is not death. It is another process that can defy both theory and law, that can defy the very traditions of representation of death itself. But that does not stop the life of law. In a certain way, like death, law does not die. It always gets entangled in its own logic of representation, its own logic of reproduction, its own logic based on a tropology, that is, the combination of rhetorical tropes and the idea that tropology is nothing else than the moral and political interpretation of tropes. At the beginning of the Summa Theologiae, and I want to say that, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a thinker, I am only a medievalist, so, sorry. But I, while reading this book, what I am trying to do is to think with Daniela, to think with this book, to think with all, not with all, but with as many ways of thinking that she provides in this amazing book. And it came to me to the question of, so I started thinking about the question of the abolition of the metaphor. And then came to me the beginning of the Summa Theologiae, so this theological Summa, I guess, of Thomas Aquinas, in which at the beginning, the article 5th, I believe, of the first question, he asks, can sacred scripture use metaphors? And he answers, but of course, yes. The problem is that the moment you start using metaphors, you have to submit them to 4 kinds of interpretation. One of them is what they mean literally, although it's not quite literally because it's historically. The second one is what they mean allegorically. So how they transport you to somewhere else where that thing is not present anymore, and in its place there is something else that is represented by it. Third, he says, you have to interpret them tropologically. That means, how can you use that metaphor, that form of representation, in order to live a moral and political life, how to live in the world? But that's not all. Because your soul, which is immortal, and you own it fully, will receive also either punishment or reward. And then the metaphor will also, if you interpret it correctly from an anagogical point of view, then it will allow you to save your soul. But what happens if you abolish that? If you remove that from theological, political thinking, if you remove that from the way in which scholasticism, codification of law has produced itself, what happens when you use the power of not metapherein, so bring you elsewhere, but to matterphering, to bring things in matter that actually matters. And then matterphor is not just matterphor, it is also euphoric. It allows you to feel the intensity of the things as they can be in your presence. I have lots of things to say about questions of how this question of metaphorical thought also defy questions that are inherent to the formulation, to the heuristics and hermeneutics of law, like, for instance, legal fictions, what happens when you abolish as well the very idea of legal fiction, because as a matter of fact, that's only a strategy to make you feel that that fiction is protecting you from the power of law, that you are in a certain way always living in a state of suspension that we can call fiction. But metaphorical approach to that can change the way in which we conceive of legal fictions and their political and legal strategies. But I am not going to continue because I promised I would be brief, and I am not going to talk about things that I wanted to talk, like for instance the question of the right to biographies or autobiographies, and how the question of autobiography was essential to the production or to the implementation of inquisitorial systems in which the defendants were immediately asked the question, tell me the story of how and why we detained you. So creating the premise that there was a reason, that there is a story to tell there. But what about, what if we establish this other process, this other metaphorical process? And I'm not going to talk about the rights or the laws on possession and the laws of colonization in the Middle Ages, in cartographies, for instance, in which the islands that were represented as small coins in gold and silver, Coney Islands, that were there represented in the map, in the Catalan Atlas of 1375, for instance, because these were not just places where people lived, but pieces that conveyed riches that were there to be possessed. I will just end with a question that perhaps I missed in the book because I have only read it twice, and it's incredibly dense and incredibly rich and powerful. The question is, where is now, after I read this book, where is now not just the letter of the law, where is the spirit of the law that does so much political work in our daily lives? Where is, and how can we now submit to criticism this distinction, this dichotomy between letter and spirit in regards to the law? And I'll end here because otherwise it will be too long. But thank you so much. I am going to read this many more times. Thank you.
Thank you.
Many thanks. And next, Prince from Princeton, Eduardo Cadava.
Shall I go here?
Yeah, absolutely. You should stand on the chair if you can. They're a little unstable.
Okay. Well, first I just want to begin by thanking Peter for his kind invitation to have me be part of today's celebration, and Daniela for being the occasion of our gathering today. I've known Daniela since soon after her arrival in graduate school at Princeton. I remember the first encounter. She wanted to insist on getting in a class that I was teaching that was already full. And it was a course that I was doing with Eyal Weizman called Conflict Shorelands, and it included a trip to the Amazon. And it was very late. It was full. She was tenacious. And she even offered to go without getting the prerequisite required vaccinations. But in any case...
I am pro-vaccines though.
Yeah. But it was, anyway, somebody pulled out, there was a space, she was vigilant and alert, and as soon as somebody emptied a seat, she was there. And she became a really essential part of the class and eventually became our assistant in the next iteration of that project, which was in the Negev Desert. So she has traveled with me. And we've been, I guess it was 2015, because I think that was when we did the course. So So it has been one of my great pleasures, actually, to see her and her work flourish. The book we're celebrating today is just one of her several accomplishments during this time. And like everyone else, I want to express my congratulations and my deepest admiration. At the same time, I have to confess that because of the duration of our relation and friendship, it is impossible for this scene not to have for me a slight character of fantasy or irreality, an air of improbability, of unpredictability, even an air of improvisation, even though I'm reading. How to respond to this wondrous book when each moment in it has its force, its logic, its singular strategy. It will be necessary to reread everything, to reconstitute each moment and its trajectory, the themes and arguments of each, the discursive traditions and the many texts it sets to work, and this only to begin. But what is it to respond to an invitation? An invitation must always simultaneously leave us free and take us hostage, enable us to take a certain liberty and bind us to a certain responsibility. Appearing in the form of an invitation, Matterphorics, the laws of theory, asks us to break free from the iron shackles of traditional modes of thinking and writing, while also asking us to think of the responsibilities we incur when we think and write with others. It invites us to think the law in relation to at least three neuralgic points. First, the role and place of the body within the law, including the way in which the law traverses the entirety of our body, and not only its parts. According to Daniela, the law has to be thought in its materiality and embodiment. It is not to be restricted to legislation, rules, and texts. It involves the eyes that look at evidence, the ears that hear testimony, the mouths that bear witness, or the noses that sniff out crimes of morality. But these organs are never simply themselves either, since their functions are neither entirely physiological nor entirely functional. This acknowledgement requires a reconceptualization of the law and a thinking of where it is and where it isn't, or where it is even if in another guise. Second, the way in which objects are never just objects, but rather archives of an entire network of historical relations, of unforeseeably mediated relations, just like each of the senses. Daniela seeks to reconstruct these relations and histories from the objects before us, from the aleatory memories of sensations, suggesting along the way a relation among sensations, objects, and humans, none of which are ever just themselves. Third, if the law touches everything, if nothing escapes it, then what is at stake is an understanding of the essential interdisciplinarity of the law, something that prevents the law from ever being identical to itself. Daniela insists that we open the law to its presumed others, and that the law, always inhabited by these others, can always only exceed itself. As a consequence, and in relation to the question of synesthesia in particular, it is in the oscillation among the senses, in the coupling of seeing and not seeing, hearing and not hearing, speaking and not speaking, touching and not touching, and the human and non-human that responsibilities form. Daniela calls for new experiences of communities, frontiers, and identities without models, and perhaps even without laws as we generally have understood them. The emphasis on law's relation to the senses and to never just one asks us to reread an entire lexicon of the law. Autonomy, sovereignty, the state, freedom, choice, testimony, evidence, contract, nature, rights, jurisprudence, governance, property, authority, equality, community, decision, self, person, human, citizen, stranger, pain and injury, torture and terrorism, death, mourning, and justice. Daniela's work is deeply interdisciplinary, but in ways that ask us to rethink what interdisciplinary work might be, working at the intersection of, among other fields, law, critical and literary theory, philosophy, anthropology, artificial intelligence, quantum physics, synthetic biology and genetics, quantum mechanics, media studies, climate science, literature, the history of technology, critical race studies, and the natural sciences in general. She helps us reconceptualize the work we do and need to do within the humanities and especially beyond. insisting that what is most needed is a vigilant and unrelenting insistence on the materiality that not only circulates within each of these disciplines, but also helps constitute them, whether they acknowledge it or not. She seeks to explore the ubiquity of the law and the matter without which the law would never be able to be executed or realized, and perhaps especially when it seeks to erase or minimize its dependence on this materiality. But here, her discussion of the law becomes a means for her to gesture in the direction of the laws that move the world. Her insistence on the matter at the heart of law and theory, at the heart of any act of reading or writing, is for her an ethical political responsibility that should be the prime mover of our intellectual and political work. Her book is therefore a kind of beginner's guide on how to do work, beginning from the presupposition that everything always has to be thought together, that nothing ever exists in isolation or outside of relation, and that our work should always proceed in relation to the world in which it takes place, a world that is always carried within every one of our gestures. What is at stake for her at each step of the way is, in her words, an ethics of thought as lived relationality. Beyond its argument, though, what is also remarkable about the book is the form of its presentation, the way in which it performs and enacts within the very movement of its language what it wishes to convey. The work is wonderfully performative. In its multiple voices, in its incorporation of innumerable references, in its various repetitions and returns, contractions and expansions, and even in its playfulness, in a world in which everything is related, Daniela insists that we always read and write with others, that we can never read and write by ourselves. And that in fact, and here she follows Donna Haraway, it matters with whom we read and write. What she reveals along the way then is the vast network of others, critics, philosophers, animals, natural elements, oceanic and atmospheric particles with which she writes. This network is enacted in her writing by its constant circulation of references and by the wide community of writers and thinkers who countersign her book, who write with her, even as this community gets filtered through the lens of Daniela's very singular way of assembling it. The very singular way in which she both inscribes herself within this community and exceeds it. This community, of course, includes, among others, Karen Barad, Alfred Whitehead, Rosie Bradotti, Judith Butler, Anne Carson, Deleuze and Guattari, Edouard Glissant, Donna Haraway, Franz Kafka, Achille Mbembe, Antonio Negri, Friedrich Schiller, Anat Singh, Eduardo Riveros de Castro, and with us today, Elizabeth Povinelli and Patricia Williams. But it also includes all the other collaborators, all the more unusual counter-signatories of her book, with which she also writes: air, oxygen, outer space, water, oceans, brittle stars, quantum particles, mountains, skies and rivers, rocks and vegetation, the earth and all its non-human inhabitants. What does it mean to write with both human and non-human collaborators? What is the best way to signal what it would mean for a living human and non-human being to read and write, and how can we best display this process? Daniela's book comes to us in the form of a beginner's guide, again, a kind of first effort that might help us imagine what this multiply authored, multi-species book might look like. Among other things, it would require, in Daniela's words, a mode of writing, thinking, and doing theory that is impersonal, yet accountable, inherently collaborative, yet singular, a mode of writing that would every step of the way reveal, expose, and convey the wild crowd that she is. Daniela not only demonstrates her familiarity with the newest efforts to think about our post-human condition, a condition that of course has always been present, even when it was still unthought, but she puts these efforts into a kind of practice in her writing itself. In doing so, her book can be said to come in quantum form, organized as it is around matters of complementarity, uncertainty, wave function, superposition, and entanglement. After a beautiful opening vignette entitled How to Begin, a Guide, the first signal that what we have before us is a kind of manual for how to read, and in particular, how to read differently, how to begin differently. Daniela divides her book into three parts: synesthetics of thought, doing theory metaphorically, enforcers of law, a metaphorical case of man falling, and cutting-edge theory, life storytelling, and an epilogue. Her argument is wonderfully cumulative, and each section reinforces and enhances what has come before it. Finalized in the immediate aftermath of a global pandemic, in the course of the rise of racism in general and anti-Black violence in particular, an upsurge of authoritarianism and fascism around the world, an intensification of different forms of inequality, an escalation of conflicts and wars of all kinds, an increase in the dispossession of populations and enforced migrations, an acceleration of environmental catastrophes globally, and the expansion of artificial intelligence, Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, and what we might call the coming digital imperium. Daniela's book is a great resource for thinking about how we might do political work, with thinking and acting at the heart of such work, at a moment in which it is increasingly difficult to match the speed of the unraveling nearly everywhere. Daniela closes her book with the forensic work she and her Logisch Fantasie Lab have been doing as a means of giving a concrete example of the way in which the laws of theory she's been delineating can be mobilized in the direction of collaborative political projects that, taking their point of departure from rather extensive material processes, can help translate, even if in displaced manners, what she has argued throughout her book. Hers is a book that comes in the form of field philosophy, a philosophy that materializes itself on the ground, as it were. Throughout, she urges us to widen the scope of what we can read, and in so doing, encourages us to rethink not only what reading is, an act that never begins in just one person or even in just one human, but what we are considering when we begin to read this or that entity, event, phenomena, or material trace. What she knows is that nothing is ever just one thing, and what she has produced is a text that, more than a text, never moves far away from this insight. Instead, it unfolds in relation to it. While it may never be clear whether Daniela's effort to move beyond language is successful, it is clear that without considering the questions she raises and even addresses, we cannot even begin to understand what language is. What makes language language may be the fact that it can never be just itself, and this because, as she demonstrates so beautifully time and time again, language itself can never appear without matter, without an entire network of relations that ask us to rethink our relation not only to the materiality of our existence, but also to the materiality of the world in which we live and die every day. There would be much more to say about Daniela's wonderful book, but I want to close simply by saying that it has been one of my greatest pleasures to witness its evolution. If it is a book that engages, and I would say extends, recent efforts to think about the relations between theory and the world, thought and materiality, language and the earth, and thinking and politics. I believe that it will contribute greatly not only to contemporary debates over the relation between theory and politics, but also to the most important discussions about how we can do political work. Daniela's book offers us a kind of training manual for this work, and the success with which she has produced this project augurs well for her future. Indeed, I would say that this is the kind of project that can inaugurate and even make a career that Daniela has already begun with great splendor. We owe her a very felt debt for what she has given us. You should all read the book. Thank you, Daniela.
Thank you.
Fabulous. Well, embrangled in pleasure, and we move from A to Z, from the responses of the elders to a youngling who is of Daniela's generation. Entry for content, exit for style. So Zulaikha, it's all yours.
All right. Sorry, I'm going to offend the crap out of some of you who believe in language, but it is what it is. Okay, hello, I'm Zulaikha, and I come to you from the world of architecture. More specifically, I work at the intersection of spatial epistemologies and the atom bomb. I've been a frequent lurker amongst the legal theory crowd ever since I first came in contact with Daniela almost a decade ago. In addition to being BFFs for about just as long, I also had the enormous privilege of being her closest interlocutor in the years in which this book first took shape. Thereby, I was always in the unique position to, keeping with the book's theme regarding thinking with whom's thoughts, think with my dearest friend's thoughts, thinking a Danielian mode of thought, if you will. Hoping that catches on. For a little biographical context, Daniela began her legal studies in the strictly disciplined and rigorous halls of Viennese universities before becoming a literature scholar and critical theorist in the halls of Ivy Leagues. I, to borrow Professor Goodrich's phrase, from one of several baroquely opulent email correspondences of recent, am an errant personage who drew and painted her way through thoughts and said, I am a Foucauldian, she is a Deleuzian. As is clearly demonstrated in the book we are all here to celebrate, Gandorfer's mastery of language, her precision, intensity, and fearlessness is Olympic grade. While my, to invoke another one of the book's themes, greatest enemy across the Schmittian line is the written word itself. So two very different backgrounds and fields of expertise, to say the least. And yet our cartographies aligned in 2017, where we had our very first conversation while walking across the rubble of al-Hiran, a now demolished Palestinian Bedouin village in the Negev desert. That conversation has never ended. So, as already stated, Gandorfer's command of that which is deemed literary is abundantly obvious, but more impressively, and so rarely found in said halls of elite institutions, is her command of Western philosophical concepts and modalities spanning from antiquity through the present, a sentiment shared also by Deborah Tisaniel in her review of the book on the back cover. In between classes, library sessions, and even laundry and grocery runs, Daniela taught me deconstruction, process philosophy, legal theory, and the nuances of the German literary canon. She was very patient. I asked a lot of questions, but it was far more exciting to have her explain things to me than having to read about them in solitude. She's also obsessed with fascism, very differently than one would expect from an Austrian.
Thank you.
Quote, everyone has the potential of being a fascist, Zulaikha. Everyone, everyone, everyone. She seems to have been born with a kind of micro-fascist radar that can smell it before anyone else. Anyway, she's also very meticulous. This lady takes no shortcuts. I can attest to this, ever. No cliff notes and few, if any, secondary sources. She prefers to read in the native language of the written source if possible. So dedicated to the stakes of her writing, she has on many occasions deleted pages and pages of writing full stop. I simply cannot express to you the magnitude and depth of horror I experienced every single time I watched her casually press 3 keys on her laptop, disappearing days, even weeks of carefully constructed prose. Psychopath. I am certainly intentionally being sentimental by sharing these personal and behind-the-scenes anecdotes, but also as a means to make sensible the real experience of doing interdisciplinarity, which is far more effective when wrestled with across the cascade of spaces and roles we inhabit in daily life. It is not often fun or easy work. The stakes are very high for each party. Conversations become heated arguments the closer and closer and shorter the approach to the respective and inevitable dividing lines which contour the formwork of our thought and experience, both in the real and on paper in the real, etc., etc. And this remains troubling because despite urgent signals from every latitude on Earth that would benefit from, even require, the cohesion of deliberate, expertly constructed, multidisciplined attention, real interdisciplinary thought and work is tragically rare. The hardened edges of knowledge silos are indeed, metaphorically speaking, sturdier than the levees. Anyway, I want to share the gist of one such animated debate to further render and color the backdrop of this book. It was a long one, months, years. It isn't yet settled, to be honest. And it concerns the dominion of words, of language, and especially written language over other forms of making sense or sense-making and expression. On that point, we agree. Where we quickly split is in the degrees to which this holds as an axiom and also what to do about it. I am an extremist. The written word for me is, for me, the ultimate hubris of Western thought. Keeping with language in search of future realities, further becomings, renders the effort moot at the very starting line. That ontology could possibly be written is so intensely, exceedingly, incredibly, tremendously, supremely, severely, and seriously absurd to me. Its codification, its utility, its sovereignty makes it representationalism par excellence. pushing its post-deconstructional limits has produced neologisms filled with so many dashes, slashes, and parentheses that meaning itself is rendered illegible. I know, I'm sorry, okay?
No problem.
Okay. I argued that it ultimately did not matter how minutely and precisely the hairs being split on paper are, that keeping with the trouble requires not keeping with language. But then Daniela managed to write, edit, and publish an entire fucking book at the same time with the highly esteemed Duke University Press, and it so happens that it's quite good. Seriously, it proves that words matter, and not for words' sake alone, Zulaikha. If I deem myself a carrier of the particular set of values I've imagined for myself, then I'd better pay attention, because words matter to the degree of literal life and death over and over and over and over again. I cannot think of a more difficult and impossible task than to transform language, and not any language, but the languages of law, of philosophy, of journalism, of social media, into a topological field. If there are any architects in the room, it feels as momentous as a task as jumping from Euclidean geometry to NURBS modeling. Again, no shortcuts. The depth of scholarship alone makes this book a standout, even amongst the highest of academic circles, which incredulously is somehow not a given. But what makes this text so important to me is the meticulous, razor-sharp composition of words, of language, which performs an ethics that is unyielding to and even indicting of its reader, myself included. For instance, take this passage which concludes the chapter on legal and literary subjecthood, where on the very fact that there exists a binary conceptualization of life versus death, Gandorfer states of this binary cut that it, quote, does not guarantee that what is ultimately rendered as a life will be consistent with our current understanding of human life, nor with who we urgently aim to include in this inherently exclusive category. If the right to a life relies on an onto-epistemological separation between life and non-life, then it is as much a right to exist as it is a license to efface existences. Such efficacious passages are found every third page or so, where Daniela not only attends to the sins of her respective disciplines, but pushes us all the way through to the other side. The book demands for us to stay unsettled, to stay bothered, to stay in touch with how our, your, their words, how our, your, their buildings, how our, your, their politics, money, food, tweets, bodies and flesh are multi-scalar registers, embodiments, and inheritors of modes of thought. To be honest, it's frightening as hell. To conclude, and because the publishers appallingly did not provide a sufficient biography of the author herself, I will recite one now. Daniela Isabella Gandorfer was born on June 15, 1988, to mother Sabrina Kantz and father Bernhard in Österreich's southernmost state, and is thereby a Corinthian. Described as a self-determinative, brave, badly organized, and lethal people, Corinthians are also hardy and alpine. Historical figures of note from the region tend towards the extreme. Their literary output is in particular eliciting a sharp, critical, and dark edge. The granddaughter of anti-fascist activists who were interned in a Nazi concentration camp for their resistance, winner of Austria's top young scientist award in a ceremony presided over by the country's former Minister of Education, Heinz Fassmann, who is 6'8" tall. While the term fascist is, curiously, absent from the index of her latest publication, Matterphorics on the Laws of Theory, Daniela deploys the word death 78 times. That's it.
That is awesome.
Okay, so let us proceed to questions. We don't have that long, we have 20 odd minutes, so I'll throw it open to the floor, unless Daniela wishes to open proceedings by telling us one thing that she strongly disagrees with in the responses that she's witnessed just now.
In alphabetical order.
There's more to say about Corinthians. No, but I do want to say, obviously everyone will get a very, very long thank you email and call, and to a degree that will annoy you. But yeah, I just want to say I don't know what to say. Like, Patricia, it's such an honor what you said and how you framed it and what you. Yeah, I don't see myself that way, but also know that my mode of thinking about synesthesia was informed by your way of teaching and writing. So it's, And I cannot thank you enough for your friendship and mentorship. And there will be a very long email. Just let me say that. And then Beth, too, I think one of the most hurtful moments recently in my life, and yes, that does speak to privilege, is when you got cut off. Because I'm like, no, please, I was almost on my knees. But it, of course, Peter, makes sense in terms of... now I want to just, email and call you constantly to, talk with you, not about my work, but your manuscript that you sent me, which, also very, very, very long letter that you can decide to read or not. But thank you so, so much for that deep engagement and bringing up the list. Jesús, I mean, Austrians don't talk about their feelings. This is a thing. It is very difficult, but I'm really overwhelmed also by the in-depth of your engagement. There are many avenues you opened up. I thought about leaving academia because what's the point of thinking? And I'm like, I have to follow that thought. That is really interesting. So I might just stay a little longer. And thanks a lot for that. It's really, there is no greater gift, I think.
Will I get a long email?
Very long. Very long, thank you, many. Also, Eduardo will get a very long email. It's difficult to respond to that because we have worked together for such a long time and you brought in so much more than just the book. We will always disagree on language, but I also thank you for that because I think it gave me like the motivation of really prove the point that you might be wrong. That's not true.
Cherish that moment.
Yes, I do. Thank you. And then Zulaikha, Zulaikha has co-written this book. It's not a overstatement. I couldn't put the name on the book, but it deserves to be there. She's just brilliant, and thank you. I wanted to say that, and I don't disagree. That was emotional for me.
Well, clearly Daniela is spent, but Alex.
Yeah, I had a question. I'm kind of curious, what is the world that you envision if the kind of legal community like this book kind of goes through it very quickly, people agree with it? What is the world that you envision if people agree in the legal world with your book?
That's a very cool question. So I mainly work now with AI and blockchain and with people also outside of academia that are building this private and privatized legal system, not just arbitration system, but private cities, court system, where the idea is you can encode everything you need into financial technologies, and that's about it. And when I started this, it was kind of, I thought, they're a little crazy hardcore libertarians, tech bros. But right now, there are so many very well-funded projects that have $500, $600 million funding in building these. And my dream would be that this book helps or engages thought within academia, because I think what we need a lot of thinkers, and that's something we can do, and we are trained in, to go into these fields and build alternatives, and not one universal alternative, but go to the different places and try to build legal concepts with the technology or without the technologies and offer alternatives to what's happening. I do not think, and that might be just me, that we will have law schools in the way that we have them now, simply because technology is rapidly changing what we need and what law and normativity is. But then how do we educate ourselves, and how do we get all the things that we learned and the mistakes that we made, how can we not reiterate them? And that would be the dream, so that it kind of goes in outside of the academy and helps building concepts.
John?
So when you disembody the law into inchoate like structures like AI and things like that, how do you prevent the very structure? Because the technology now is a black box. You're relying on the programmer and the person that created the AI LLM to create a more, I guess, equal world, but that may not be the case. How do you stop that from becoming just another tool of the state?
I think this is happening, and it's a tool of the state, but it's more so a tool for private companies to shape normativity and legal systems of the future. And exactly what you critiqued, I think this is happening. And I think that's also what I meant with concept creation. It's so we're used to law being a matter of the state, and to a degree being public and public courts. I think this is disappearing. And so the question for me is, can we use these technologies to build more community-based legal systems? For example, it's very abstract, but can we imagine a decentralized right to breathe? What would this mean? This would mean, in terms of a right, what a right does is changing the behavior of people so that we protect certain people and make sure that people also take their responsibilities seriously. So we are used to think about rights from a state perspective, but what if we use the technologies and communities and construct their behaviors in a different way? And so we understand normativity differently. So what the answer would be is, I think we have to involve people, communities, and those with the highest stakes more in the construction of normative systems in the future. And I think the technologies have an enormous power that I'm not sure that states will have in the future, since they are already outsourcing to technology and private actors. So that's my worry. So I don't believe in the technology, but I believe in using it as a tool while keeping to the values of communities and culture.
Just one quick follow-up. So you mentioned oxygen.
Yeah.
So people have different oxygen requirements. How do you, as far as the normativity goes, how do you prevent someone from creating another being that uses a different type of oxygen, and then that self-selects that being over the other beings? Like you're what you're doing is you're creating a system where the equality of those persons, of whatever the normativity decision is, it's a black box of selectivity. How do you avoid that? Like, are there audits of it? How do you, who's actually watching the watchers, in other words?
I think you're thinking along the lines of what's happening also problematically in algorithmic decision making. So my argument would be that we don't outsource decision making to technology, but bring technologies to a wider range of people who can make decisions. For example, there are blockchain systems. So I'm not talking about cryptocurrencies, but blockchain systems that allow for governance rights and voting rights of everyone in a community. Let's say we have a community of people that want to improve air quality. So these are people that live in that area. This can be the government, this can be private actors. So what I would say is that if you give the decision power, if you decentralize the decision power and you use the technology to give power to people, it's a very different thing from outsourcing it to technology. Because as you say, the technology is a centralized attempt, either the state or a private actor, to monetize or control behavior. So if we could construct something in addition to state and private, then I think this is where communities and different stakeholders, then we go away from the question of algorithmic decision making.
And you believe that's possible?
Oh yeah.
And considering Brandeis's type of corporate issue, and that corporations were the biggest evil.
But is the question if I think the corporations are the biggest evil?
No. Just saying that it's based on the same premise that corporate existence outside of public and private is better than trying to democratize the individual. And I don't mean to monopolize everything. It's just very interesting.
There was a question there. Yeah.
So, I would just remind you that the pioneers of Silicon Valley sold the regulators in the Democratic Party here on a flourishing technology-driven democracy as a way of discouraging them from trying to regulate the new industries, and they bought it, and now they're paying a pretty serious price. But I wanted to ask you, we once talked about the future of state boundaries, and I'm wondering, in the years that have transpired, if you have any new thoughts about that, if they're obsolete or soon to be, and why, and if they're going to survive, why?
Yeah, that goes back to a very interesting car ride, because the trains, the Amtrak, of course, did not run from New York to Boston, and so we had a car ride with Patricia and Hamilton Fish. I think, and this is what I'm observing in that space, I think it just progressed faster with the technology and with exactly what you said, with governments becoming more anarcho-capitalist, becoming more, penetrated by exactly the actors we talked about, tech bros, Silicon Valley investors, that if you look at the US government, but also the UK government and other smaller governments, they have outsourced and privatized a lot of government functions. I mean, we know Wagner Group, the military, that's an easy one. And then maybe in the US, healthcare is also an easy one, but way more of these technologies. If you look at Palantir, they have just presented a new military technology that is, and if you think about the fact that Peter Thiel wants Greenland so he can have a private city with its own court system, a company becoming basically a city, and these technologies, then for me the question there is, where is the state, where is the sovereignty, and where is the power of these very powerful companies? And another example is Prospera, which is also it was a special economic zone in Honduras, and is now a private city with its own legal court system and its own. The only thing they take from the Honduran government is criminal law, because who cares about that in that direction. And that was an endeavor by the same tech pros and by a company called Prospera Ltd. They wanted to go there and set up this little private thing, which they did, and there was a kind of right-wing government back then that even changed their constitution so they can set that up, because you can't just, take sovereign land that easily. Then the people voted into a center-left, and so they restored the constitutional rights of people. And now Prospera Ltd., which is a US company, is suing Honduras, the state, for $10.8 billion, which means if they succeed, it's more than a third of their GDP. So they will settle, because otherwise but if you think about the fact that a US company which has its own legal system and argues it wants to be a sovereign state, city, whatever, can bankrupt a government, then I think the lines have blurred, to say the least.
So, Maggie?
Do you think this decentralization of lawmaking or power from the state will increase hyperlocal communities or kind of decrease that aspect?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. I think what's happening is that even the claims of decentralization and the building of such models are again done by very, very strong and powerful corporations that use it as a narrative to actually not decentralize anything, but monopolize new data markets. I think, and that also goes back to the question of what the book ideally in my dream mind could do. Ideally, we would get more people into that space and build with local communities of all kind and think about how we can bring these networks, decentralized networks, together. And I've traveled to a lot of these tech conferences they always have great side events. The conference is bad, but and there are a lot of people. I've met a lot of cool projects in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Vietnam, in Thailand, in Brazil, incredibly intelligent ways of structuring and coding the technology and bringing people in and the state, but they don't get funded. So if you get 500 million immediately for Praxis, which is the new network state of Western civilization, the new empire, but you don't get much for these models, I think that's our issue, and that's why I think if more people go into that space and bring money and thought into it, then maybe we can get a better balance. Right now it doesn't look good, I think.
Hi, I'm Nigel.
I know.
I just want to say thank you, first of all. I was in Princeton University Library at museum with all you are gathering and feeling that there was something much bigger than in the room, and I'm still feeling that right now, all the way to Paris and 27th Street. But there's something else that made me feel really hopeful in a weird way in the conversation. Is primarily around death and the way that you've been talking about death. Because while we're talking about the horizon as opening up to the future, which I think you already saw back 10 years ago, there's also the negative horizon of normativity that I wanted to talk about as well. In regard to Palantir, for instance, in 2016, Columbia University was like telling students to sign up for Palantir while they were actually participating with NYPD to have a raid in Grant housing. When we're talking about non-centralized community, I'm thinking about St. George University, which is in Grenada, and how Grenada was its own experiment. That was also thinking about councils and so forth. And when we talk about community, I think, and the way they were answering the questions, I was wondering if that community is still defined by the normativity that we have now, or can we really interrogate those that have been already deemed criminal, that have already been disassociated with the normative community? I'm thinking about the kids who've been arrested by Palantir in 2016 and the knowledge that they carry. I'm thinking about the families that are destroyed in Grenada and the kind of memories that they may carry as well. Is that just a question about memory? Is that a question about me being melancholic? Or can Matterphorics really deal with the traces of the knowledges that may not have manifested in the kind of utopias we want to have right now, but could be used in the legal context as well? Because there is still claims to be made about Honduras and Grenada as two contexts for thinking about these extra legal state modes too. So I was wondering if you could talk about the negative horizons, what's been lost so far, and what can we maybe recuperate with the language of Matterphorics?
That's a good question. I don't think it will answer. I think you stated a problem that just asks for a way longer thinking. And
Sorry.
No, that's cool. That's like Jesús is like, yeah, give me something to think. But I think that one of the problems, to maybe counter or add to this, one of the problems when we think about what is a community and who, even if we imagine that, let's open up the technology to all the different communities, in real life, there are so many, obviously, obstacles to that. For example, one is what I said with there are better ways of forming a community, other ways of normativity that have existed not just long before Matterphorics, but long before the Western ideas of what normativity is. They exist, they are not new. The question for me would be, how can we democratize, okay, it's a loaded word, but how can we open that space up, and the space of power, which for me is technology and data at the moment, so that we can open it up to more voices, to more ideas, and maybe create a space that different people, different ideas, different culture can find their own way into what it might mean for them, and how technology or Matterphorics or thinking about normativity could have a meaning in their lives. So it would be far from me to even, and now I forgot who put, I think Jesús, you said that, the attempt was also to show that we have to open up different ways of thinking and make that space instead of colonizing the idea of thinking, so that different forms of thinking and normativity can evolve. And the problem still is power, tech and finance. I do not know how to solve that. I do not know another person who is building like a tech collective in Uganda. She said, look, this is a cool idea and have all the people on board. And we even have funding from the UN. but there's so much corruption on the ground, and there's no way that this network will not be attacked by the government. So I don't know. That's in short, I really don't know, but it's a very good thing to think about.
So we end with non-knowledge. We end with the unthought. And huge applause both to those who've come from Paris and Daniela for mattering forth. And those of you who have copies of her book, she's happy to matter forth her signature. And so, great thanks. And cardamom buns are to be tried. Here, pass the buns. Pass the buns.